You can go ahead.
All right. Good evening from the Netherlands. Thank you for having me. I'm happy to speak today about Belarus 2020, which came out as a board game under the title I'm Not Afraid. There are a couple of topics in one presentation. I will speak about the perfect prototype, or is it rather a curse than a reality? Is it even possible? And I want to speak about moving from an idea to the table. So how to take that prototype into production. At the same time, I will also touch upon choosing the topic and design choices. So that would be the whole package. And the game that I will be speaking about is on the title slide. So that's how it looks like unraveled after 2 years in the making. But I did start to work on it already in 2020 and it came out this year. Before we start, a couple of words about me. I'm a lecturer in the Safety and Security Management Studies at the Hague University of Applied Sciences. Before that, I worked in NATO to design new types of war games and new scenarios. I also spoke about the book that you see on the left side during one of the talks at Georgetown University Wargaming Society. So it's very nice to be back and speak now about board games, which is also the follow-up with the second book that came out as an experience of teaching wargaming as opposed to only practicing. If you would like to contact me afterwards about any of the things I was speaking about, you can see my email, Twitter, and LinkedIn at the slide. So if you look at a bit of my background, you might understand that Belarus was a very important topic to me. So at the time of the protests in 2020, we used to refer to it as the last dictatorship in Europe. What it meant is it had the same leadership and a very fixed regime since the end of the Cold War. And with the latest elections results announced on the 9th of August 2020, and with the results of continued presidency of Lukashenko, there was a mobilization on the social side to counter that results. And it started with cities, then it moved into workplaces and escalated into opened hostilities with longer time of the protests. Also more and more groups joined. Unfortunately, that also led to new forms of repression and now political prisoners being taken hostage by hundreds in Belarus. So if I am presenting this, obviously you are seeing how I would perceive the events. But one of the most important choices that I had to make when I was designing a board game on this topic is, how will I portray the situation? Will I choose to show equal perspectives where I'm seeing one side from the dominant regime, or will I directly look into the asymmetric power and how opposition was suppressed, which is largely what we have been speaking about in either Netherlands or Poland. So starting from that point, I looked at a game that definitely would be two-sided, and two players seemed the most natural because you could either play as the opposition with its leadership or as the regime with the president at that time. And of course, there are many complexities that lean itself to this topic, but I wanted to show majorities. So how do you actually come to either success or failure of the revolution. So that was why we looked at potentially taking over a location or a group. And it was a 1-0 game, so there would be one winner at the end. And this would be your player board. So as the president, but also as the opposition, you had the same options. You could go into one of the locations, move between locations, retreat, meaning taking back resources, or you could roll to have more of them. And optionally, you could convert using, for example, media or internet, and you could claim a location. So if you successfully filled it, you would be able to say, Minsk is mine. You could also unlock goals that gave you more options, and you see that on the bottom of the player board. And those were mini missions inside the game, which would speed up your deployments. If you were able to use these actions to secure 5 locations, the game would directly end and sum up the points that were assigned to the locations. Obviously, the more points, the more difficult location was to overtake. So this is the basic of the game, but obviously it took quite a while to get it to this streamlined version. I started with what I always say to my students, meaning what do I want the most? If we think about board games as mediums, they are sending either a message or providing experience. So what is for me the most important? And I like to start with writing out things that I want to do with the attributes that you can also communicate to potential audiences. So within the simplified table, you can see, for example, interactivity, number of players. Is it based on reality, or do you want to include fictional scenarios? And I set out to do it with Belarus. First of all, I only included a reality into the game. For me, the topic was too urgent, important. It was also at that time brutality was rising, so I couldn't imagine including fiction into that equation. It was too important that it must remain within fact-checked area. So on both sides, of course, there could be propaganda, so it had to be researched to the every point being realistic. But I will say that it is abstracted. So I did not present the stories of singular journalists that at that moment were persecuted. I was showing a location with journalists as a group. If you look further at the complexity, I put in medium because actually for me or most gamers, it was a pretty straightforward game, so I would put it as low. But for beginners, it was medium because there is worker placement, there is gaining majorities, there are optional actions and mini missions. So for people that are kind of not in the same field, it was medium. So I stuck to that description. In terms of difficulty, the main problem was where do you want to commit resources and whether you are able to gain majority. So that tension was reflected within the game. And from the interviews I did while preparing the setup, it was clear that there were big groups of supporters on both sides. So obviously the 80% that was proclaimed as the victory was not factual, but it could have been as close as 51-49. So I wanted to put forward that idea of one majority in one location would be winning the game. I would say that there is a lot of randomness because we are working with dice. But I would also propose it is mediated because there are locations that allow re-rolling dice. It is possible to withdraw them. So there is a way to use dice in a strategic manner. I did want from the beginning to limit the time of play to 30 minutes. And if I thought about it simply as showing the tension of majorities and the complexity of the social movements at the time of the revolution, then it was enough to play for 30 minutes to understand that. And I did want to potentially have it as an educational tool within 1 hour time span. So that already carves down on the complexity, right? If you have only 15 minutes to explain by your own limitation, then you cannot include many of the more advanced mechanisms. As I mentioned, I did want to have two sides, so two players are for me the most natural way to play the game because you also have more agency and ownership of the actions. I can imagine it being played by teams, but it's just extended time span, right? It does not improve the gameplay. And the interactivity is low because the only interaction that the two sides have are tiebreakers. So potentially if both sides are present at the location, the dice that decides tiebreaker could be kicked out, put back in, and there is a kind of persistence game to that. And goal cards, so we could be strategizing to the same goal and somebody would be quicker than me. So those were the design choices I've started with, and over time I made notes on why things look that way, which helped a lot in development, but also in testing. So if somebody has a proper questioning feedback, hey, why does it cost me 2 moves to do that? You are able to respond, well, in reality, that was the case. So that's how I see it. And you have more and more thinking that goes into the underlying attributes of the game, which I find to be very helpful when making decisions. And as I mentioned at the beginning, my biggest dilemma was, do we recognize that this is essentially a very big structure, thousands of people against opposition that has very few resources and only mobilization of common society at its side? Or do we stay within the both sides have equal actions and resources? In other words, what is the perspective? So are we in a God mode, like in Civilization or other games where we just can see everything that is happening, or will there be any hidden information? Do we take the historian perspective where I would say we have to fact check everything, we look at the archives, we are collecting information? Or do you want to present one of the sides as the leading narrative? So that would be the question you have to ask yourself. And that comes back to what the game is supposed to convey. Why would anybody play it? In my case, I did want to use the historian perspective, although I might say that there are fact-checked information from both sides. So I was also making it as not relative as possible, right? So the facts on the ground. And that also brings us to the question of how do you debias the materials and yourself? On the left side, you see, if you Google the dictatorship, you might get 2 pictures. One is the New Year celebration ball with everybody uniformed and very formal, and you might even say properly governmental sighting. On the lower side in the left corner, you see the protests at the embassies that were happening at the time of quashing the protests in Belarus. So which one would be more factual? So something that you can present without having the strong context and narrative in it already. And how do you also make yourself objective on things that obviously will bother you? And that is the question you might have to approach, especially with topics that are current. That is very difficult. And then you also think about decisions that are made, right, by both sides. And then you can think about either making it symmetric or asymmetric, depending on what is the most important angle. And nothing can replace player impressions. So specifically looking at people playing it today, but also last week comparing the notes on what was the experience and what was important about it for people. And then you can also see that it regulates you as a designer because you recognize whether it was what you wanted to achieve or not. So if I think about selecting elements and having all of these considerations in mind, it is also one of the best ways to look at evidence. And in my case, it was a very important work on non-violent conflicts, revolutions, uprisings, civil resistance. And I looked at Professor Chenoweth's work, which actually, by tracing and collectively looking at civil resistance, claimed that the non-violent movements are more successful than violent ones, which would put us at a very interesting moment when you look at the Belarusian Revolution. But it also mentions 4 conditions for success in these terms. First of all, it has to have, I don't want to say volume for people, but it has to have the mass that is required to win that fight, and that would be at least 3.5% of the overall population. And that condition was met in Belarus at the time, even with additional percentages. It also speaks not only about quantity, but also quality. So it requires diversity of movement over time. And this is where depiction of, for example, protests at a factory a month into the revolution is important, because it is something that would condition the success. It also mentions loyalty shifts among security forces and elites. In Belarus, we've seen police forces that were putting down weapons and joining the protesters. So this would also play into the question of, is it possible that this revolution wins? And variation of method of resistance. So we are looking at both online and offline actions. We are looking at protests. We are looking at blockades. We are looking at travels and speeches on international fora. So that is the question, whether this is enough to push the revolution forward. And response to repression without escalation. And this condition for sure was the most difficult in Belarus, because there were waves of counter-resistance and there were waves of protests. So the more protests, the more repressions. But I was looking at this research as a very interesting key to objectively select the elements I will be taking into the game, because then whatever you see in the game as a model is linked to evidence from research. So what made the cut into the final board game was the diversity in the movement. So if we look at city resistance, such as Minsk and Grodno, that were the biggest bonfires for this revolution, it was matched with, I will call it trade unions. Those are not trade unions, but large groups of the same tradesmen. So we were looking at mines and factories that took part in the protests, social organizations, women in white that were blocking police, media. So this is the part where potentially participants on both sides could be converted into changing their values. Security forces, so police is portrayed, and education, teachers and students who fairly quickly also formed their own grouping within the marches. And church played a very substantial role in sustaining the resistance. So that was also included in the locations on the board. But I also included the different forms of protests. So on one side, we have groups and locations. On the other side, we see how it is happening. So marching as the simplest action of going to a location. The more advanced one, converting participants by using media, but also travel to change the views. And there are site-specific locations, which is for the regime police, for the opposition women in white. So obviously it would be a big logical flaw if with all of this symmetry, we would allow the protesters to use police. So this is limited to one side, the same for women in white that are then linked only with opposition. And there is also a strategic dilemma of either focusing on quick majorities and trying to win that way, or longer term development. So looking at your player board and growing the mass and the diversity of the supporters. So that were the elements that made it into the game. Couple of things that did not make the cut, and this is I would say even more important than what did. Ability to select and sometimes eliminate elements will be what makes this game successful in terms of conveying a message, or unsuccessful because it just has a lot of elements that do not work out together. I did not include the overwhelming role of international assistance. I think a lot of board games fall into the temptation in portraying everything as international play. This was a very local revolution, and despite sanctions and recognition on the outside, the international assistance was not decisive in the outcome. So the points available in the game, which are present because you can see both the Russian influence on the regime and the international influence on the opposition. They are only 8% of the overall location scoring. And if somebody would push the strategy of game board and the long-term success, then that would even be less. So the international support was not a decisive power. With the abstraction that I mentioned earlier, the actual icons, the heroes, the legends, the individual stories that I think would add more to the immersion have not made the cut. We did include later expansions that have shown scenario 1 to 3, and you could follow the most notorious events of the revolution, such as the flight that was stopped in Minsk, and one of the journalists was kidnapped from the board of the plane. But that is a very important part of the revolution, but does not combine with the majorities. So that's why it had to be balanced into an expansion. So individual people were recognized, but not on the mechanical level. I mentioned it was not an international play, so geopolitics was not a topic, as well as ideology. It was not a kind of democratic expansion or EU influencing mechanism. That played a secondary, tertiary role that I did not want to focus on. And I will say that I did not include the nuclear energy. And you might ask, why do I mention it? It was specifically asked of me. So we had a playtest in one of the Wargaming conventions, and there was a person that asked me, why is there no nuclear energy in the Belarusian uprising? So if I would have to defend it, I would simply say that was again not the model of societal resistance that I wanted to focus on, but I mention it not for the reason of contemplating this choice, but for the same temptation as international strategic play of every situation. We also often see that there is more and more elements that are possible to include, but if you are able to do the attributes that I've been showing before, you are able to say why something would make the cut or not. Is it because of realism that you want to preserve? Is it because of your choice of main mechanism? What is the focus and the outcome of the game? So in my case, it was very easy to debate it and give it a good critical thought of which elements are important for my game. What you can see here in the game components is 2-player boards. They are symmetric, so the same actions are possible. 12 location cards, which reflect the diversity and different forms of resistance. Goal cards, those are the missions that could be potentially playing to the dilemma of short or long-term winning. And we are playing with dice and meeples for locations and for moving into locations. And at that point, I have to say the previous picture is very nicely laid out, but obviously it didn't start that way. So if I think about the curse of the perfect prototype, I'm using the word curse because it can haunt you. Right? You will keep on trying to improve, but at one point you must succeed. Okay, this is the version that is ready to be published. What I have discovered in my drafting is it is almost impossible to make a small change. Every time I tried, I would just invent new things, which is very valuable for, as I said, expansions or additional scenarios, but it made it almost not doable to include all of that and preserve the game as I imagined it first. So I had to make choices. And at this point, I kind of experimented with different things. On the left side, you can see the game laid out in A3 form. So you could technically shorten the player boards and decrease the size of the locations and be able to kind of bring it with you everywhere. So I really like this minimalist approach of having everything on one page. Well, what it did very well is to look at the physicality of the game. But I would also here make a disclaimer that the dangerous part is I also think about new games based on that. And that happened on the right side. So when I was working on it, one of the aspects that I really wanted to go deeper into is the role of women, which are not often seen as combatants in conflicts. But here they had a very prominent role in stopping the violence caused by police. And that was the Women in White movement that would surround the police units and prevent them from attacking protesters. And you see that I have constructed one of the versions which focused specifically on that topic. And in the small squares, you can see the symbols that they were using. On the right side, you can see the leaders of not only the opposition, but also the revolution, so more cultural and symbolic view. So in a way that of course gives you a lot of thoughts and possibilities, but it does not bring you closer to producing the game, right? You just know much more about how it could look like alternatively. So that's why I say you should not think that it will be perfect, but you should think, how can it be moved further? And I also caught myself doing this when we were working with my students at the Safety and Security Management Studies. We have a Wargaming project. And I wanted to also introduce students to working with publishers and making that connection between new prototypes and publishers. So we started off with, okay, it would be maybe too time intensive to construct new games altogether, but students could be working on expansions. And there were a couple of things that we wanted to have reflected there. There was, for example, a sabotage of railroads, of the weapons that were shipped from Russia to Belarus to be used against Ukraine. And then Belarusians actually sabotaged that transport. So that was a current development that was very important for the outcome of the revolution and obviously for security of Europe. So we gave the topic and students just invented a new game instead of doing the expansion. So I had to laugh because I thought, well, that also happens to me. And what we did promptly is not to stop them, but rather see which elements of their new game would be interesting for further development of Belarus. So that would be an advice that I can take forward, seeing, even let your imagination roll into a new game and then see if there is something that improves the current one. And speaking about going from idea to the table, I generally broke it down into 5 steps. First, brainstorming the ideas, creating concepts, prototyping. This is the part where I would generally write down my concept, look at the attributes, make notes. And it's very flexible because everything can change in that stage. But it is very good to formalize what is the core of the design and prototype fast. Otherwise, you can waste a lot of time on bad ideas. And I've seen it as well with a couple of my designs that it was a kind of mechanical solution to a difficult scenario. And I thought it was self-explanatory. And then I tried to explain it to somebody and it was not. So it's very good to not only count on your own capacity when you are designing, but actually double check it. And once you are at the stage where you can describe the core and you see that the mechanics are valid, actually it's already time to show your work to both publishers and public. And the reason is if a publisher is able to see that project or ideally pick it up, it also gives a lot of momentum to the development. Because In the next stage, you will be able to speak about the physicality. That's the part where I said I experimented quite a bit with what would be the best format. And you also can compare it to the general category your game is in. You can also garner playtesters, and it's very important to have different groups that would provide feedback. When I played it with fellow designers, I also do that. We always try to break the game, right? So we see, okay, which strategy we could push to kind of show that the model is not realistic or that something was mechanically unbalanced. But it gives you a very good impression of what can be done with this setup. Whereas if you play with the beginners, you are checking if it can be easily explained and followed. And that means if you have conducted 1,000 tests, and there are different methods, but the important part is that you have notes showing the results. You can start to polish the look. So let's say that the locations are clear to playtesters. Okay, now it's the time where they also can be aesthetically pleasing. That also means that some of the symbols can be included in the design. For example, one of the locations required the dice to remain in place. So we put a small lock on it. That makes it very natural to follow. And it's good to start announcing things, right? That brings more and more people into the topic and garners interest. And I think our premiere moved like 5 times. So it's not a problem. People would likely wait for the premiere, but the question is, do they know about it? So that is even more important than the deadlines, also the self-imposed ones. And for the publishing, of course, there has to be a plan of the campaign, as easy as 2 to 4 weeks before what will happen 2 to 4 weeks afterwards. And it's good to have additional goals, which actually we kept the expansions under these goals. So we had 99% finished, and then the expansions, the 1%, would be just finalized if the stretch goals would be unlocked. And I know it's not instinctive for most of us, but actually keep talking about the campaign, just letting people know that you are moving towards it, that you are announcing, you are finalizing elements. It takes on average 7 times to see something to buy it, and the same holds for the purchasing and publishing of board games. And as you can see in my first stage, probably the most realistic picture is the one in the middle, with just A4s printed out and played for 100 times. That is the best way to move from something that you have invented into something that is now physical. And I do have to say, there is a time where you will be getting the bad designs out of the way. I can presumably see that a couple of the ideas here were not reasonable, and because I tested them out, I could just deselect them from the development. And also in my previous life, I have been working on many different formats, so you also start to yourself recognize what is viable. And that means you will accept many defeats before success, or in other words, do not get discouraged if this is your 9th prototype that comes to the table. It is still a progress from the previous one. And often we think that it will go as a straight line upwards from pitching to discussions to conventions to a contract and to a campaign. In reality, at least in my case, it looked like this. So I was pitching the game already from 2021-22. It was fairly quickly picked up as an interesting topic and a perspective we haven't yet seen. But the discussions went on for months, and that led to that long period of experimentation that also helped with showing it at conventions and bringing up more people up to speed. And then the campaign passed straight to the sky. So it was extremely fast in the execution. So I also can share what my publisher said. They said, if it's a good game, it will be published, right? There is no reason to stress about deadlines or the process. And definitely you will have a team. So it is rarely a solitary development. I would say that when you are looking for people to join you, you should have a developer you trust. In my case, Guillaume was instrumental to bringing a structure and very qualitative and quantitative data about the game. So at one point we had a question whether a rule applies or not, and he said in 83% of the games it was used and it was positively assessed. And to that, we could easily say, all right, we keep that rule because it makes sense to playtesters and it was an improvement. And the same goes for the publisher. So you have to be able to agree on the foundations from the beginning. And then in a strange way, the timeline doesn't matter. It's just that you know what you want to achieve. You will need proofreaders for the rulebook, often multiple times, and potentially provide examples. So everybody, you come to the point where everybody that reads the rules can achieve the same interpretation. It's still difficult. It's an art to make it self-explanatory. And a graphic designer that would keep the vision of the game in mind. In my case, the colors that you see on both sides, they represent a battle of symbols between the traditional flag before the regime and the flag that was imposed afterwards. So the opposition returned to the old flag as a symbol of independent Belarus without the dictatorship, and the dictatorship tried to reinvent the identity as in it only exists for the last 30 years. And with that, I framed it as the topic is interesting. It is, of course, interesting for me, but it is not a popular conversation piece, I would gather. It is a rather focused, limited to an audience that is interested in current developments in the state of Europe and its borders. So it is important to check whether there is an audience for a topic, especially so specific as I have chosen. So I started with a flyer that would just say the game is coming and then seeing whether people are reacting to it. At that time, my majority was a working title. And again, it doesn't matter that it changes. It matters that people start to recognize you are bringing in this topic into a board game. And there was the symbol of white umbrella, which the protesters used a lot within their activities. And you see that moved into the second poster that was used from 2022 And then the final one is the cover art that was released before the campaign. And there you also see much more information, right? It is a two-player game. It is for age 12 plus, and how long would it take to play it out? So for sure, the last version is the strongest, but the question is, if you only started with that one, would there be enough interest to make the game in the end? So I would propose it's better to have a couple of versions that move around than to have one perfect one. And you can see with the development that actually you can compare it to other games, or you could also set out to make a game that is incomparable. But it's important to kind of make goals on that front. So at that time, I tried to test it at least 20 times in a month, and the developer was doing between 5 and 10 tests. So after 2 years, we came to a really good number, and that's also where the data comes from, which I have cited. So we could look back and compare, check, improve, include the feedback, and figure out how to make this game the strongest as it can be. And once the development was closed, the decision was set out to do the Kickstarter campaign. And it was funded in 48 hours. But I will say that there was a low goal thanks to the print and play version. So we didn't need huge funds in order to take this idea to the table. And in a way, you could always move into a physical box after that, but you are sure that, again, there is enough people interested in playing a game about protests in Belarus. And I can say a couple of things about the Kickstarter. First of all, it does need time to get promoted. So whether you are active on Twitter or in other social networks, it's good to keep speaking about it, because most backers do not support the project, they support the creator. So that means you as a person would be attracting more than even the fanciest game. Which was for me personally very difficult to move into, but I do speak more and more about my work, at least on Twitter and LinkedIn. I can also say that it was good to include stretch goals, right? So people themselves start to be interested, well, will that grow into 120, 140 or 170 backers? And there we could also add on the things that I wanted to do, but actually they were not in the core vision. So there was a new location that was the airport, the story I mentioned before, the journalist that was hijacked from the plane with his fiancée, that is currently a political prisoner. So you could play out the scenario specifically about that event. And we also added a second expansion about the jail, which is representation of the hundreds of political prisoners currently still sentenced in Belarus. So that has also hidden information and things that, as I said, it made me very excited to have them, but they should not cloud the core of the game. And finally, I also worked out new goal cards, and the idea was to play with the interactivity element of the game. So these goal cards would actually give you abilities. And there you could play with other people's dice, which in the core game, it is not part of the mechanisms. So that was also very fun for me to experiment with that. And if I would think about the best practice is for sure to check out the overfunded Kickstarters. So if you look at those that come up with the highest success, they are usually a series of games, right? So you see that they build audience over time, and people like to come back for things they have supported in the past and would potentially improve their game. Multi-game releases, often you see a new game, but you can also get the previous games from the same publisher. And you also see that the first Kickstarter will be the hardest, right? So after people see that the game is delivered, it's a credible creator, they would be in larger numbers coming for the next Kickstarter. At least that's what I'm trying to think after my first Kickstarter, that the longer you are in that process, the easier it should get. So what would I do different about taking the idea of Belarus to the table? I would say I would keep track of my focus. And what I mean with that is not tracking the hours, but tracking the outcomes. Because you have seen a whole new game about women in white, which is potentially super interesting, but did not contribute to the development of original Belarus game. So it was purely hours of curiosity. It was not hours of development. So now I do it different. So I say I will work only on the scales in this prototype, right? I will not touch anything else. And in that case, there is a chance that I will finish it. And I can see that the focus paid off. And I would also spend more time discussing my design. So I would say that I generally go into long bouts of focused work, which is great. But if you don't speak to people about it, it's a solitary development. Whereas if you speak about it, brainstorm it, also promote it, it gives much more value to later campaigns. And I would stop making deadlines. I would just, because then you also move the premiere a couple of times, unnecessary. You can just say coming soon, and then you give yourself more room to think about your goals. So if the goal is, I want the prototype to be 100% finished, then I announce the campaign in 4 weeks, right? That makes much more sense than 19th of August, right? That brings you pressure for no good reason. And I would make more notes. The reason is one, you can very easily make this talk. So you could speak to people about your process and the decisions you made on the way, which I largely did with my notebooks, but I would say some changes just went like, it made more sense. Or I remember that we spoke about it, but I couldn't anymore trace either the source of the information that motivated the decision, or the, in some cases, interviews that I made in the process. I just said, okay, it was in one of the conversations. And lastly, I would define my success maybe a bit better, because if the success is just the publishing of the game, it means that it ends. Whether in my case, I believe that the success is that people play it now. So I would like to see the game on the table and alive. So for sure, I would rephrase that into the longer term idea. And would I do it again? So would I follow the same track, getting my idea to the table? Yes, for sure. It was in many ways challenging, but I also hold that thought still that now that we've launched the first game, the following ones would be an easier way to focus, to frame, to produce. So I'm thinking for sure I would like to continue with the next design. My main issue is I have too many ideas and too little time. So I started to make lists of games that I want to do, and at the moment I officially do not allow myself to work on number 2 until I finish number 1. That is my solution to, I guess, wild creativity. That is the opposite of disciplined development. I think I have to take more steps on the second word. Couple of things that I will do different in the future on that note is zoom in on one idea and do not let yourself kind of get into new games instead of perfecting the first one. Much more testing, especially between the versions. I can see how much improvement came in when the publisher and the developer were looking with people whom I do not explain the game to, right? So kind of third party that can show the flaws of things that I am omitting. And I would also ask about feedback more publicly. So sometimes you see me on Twitter just throwing a picture of the game saying, something is wrong with that mechanism. And for sure you can count on solidarity in the community that will say, well, did you try that? Or that was a nice solution from a different game. So I do still utterly cherish the feedback that I'm able to get publicly. And I would just recite pressure. So just look at the progress and the steps that are required to finish the game. But no dates anymore, just getting to the right quality at the right time. And as you have heard, looking at the success in terms of this game is played by how many people, what are they noticing, what are they experiencing. That would be much more important than finalizing the design. So with that, thank you for listening to the talk. I'm happy to answer questions. You can also approach me at a later time at the links that you see on the slide. And if you are interested in the game, it is now available at Nat's publishing website. Thank you.
Hey, thanks, Natalia. I have a couple questions that were sent to me. So first things first is, so you said 1,000 tests. I know you've done a great deal of game design, so you've probably done a variable scale of playtesting. But from your experience, how much playtesting is enough before you can have confidence into publishing a game?
I would say it is enough when you don't make any changes. So it's not the number, it is the quality. So let's say we have tested it a number of times, and between iterations, there is always notes, improvement, comments, questions. So if you come to the point where everything is clear, and it's a very difficult point to zero in on, but if you are there, there would not be a benefit of further testing. You would just kind of hear the same things. So that is the point where you can comfortably stop and say, it is finished. That is the final version.
So one of the other questions is, given the topic is so relevant and sort of recent, what were some of the specific challenges on designing something that is like unfolding as you're designing the game?
Actually, that was the biggest consideration that the publisher had. So at one point, they asked me, could the topic not be an older uprising? Just keep the same mechanics and the ideas in it are very good, but could you not just historically backtrack it into a different story? So there was a lot of sensitivities. Obviously, we are speaking about people's lives. And that's why it was important with the early decision making to think about abstraction. So if we do not present a specific taxi driver that allowed a protester to escape from security services, we do not disclose the names, we do not look at individuals, but we look at the group of miners, factory workers, teachers, students. I was hoping that that represents them truthfully without putting anybody at risk. And definitely it is a big responsibility to look at it at one side objectively, but on the other side in humanitarian terms of this is the situation. And I remember when the title came in, the subtitle, A Failed Revolution in Belarus, I could not live with it. I was, as a human, in such strong discontent. I was, for a long time, speaking to the publisher, could we not change it into an ongoing revolution, right? I did not want to accept that there was an outcome and it is tragic. So in that track, you will have to reconcile what you can do as a board game designer. And my reconciliation is we will only show the truth of the events, and we will see the model that reflects how difficult it is to have a successful revolution.
So another thing that you mentioned is that this is sort of atypical for a war game to sort of look at protests and political action. What are some of the elements of that design element that you found really difficult?
I think the difficulty is, and that's why initially we have turned away from the scenarios, because there might be the trap that you follow one perspective or one incident, and that is translated into that's how the revolution went. So obviously, if we look historically at other regions, there was always a trigger point or an incident that erupted into riots. And here it was, interestingly, rather just chronological. So the results of the elections, in some ways, everybody knew that they would be falsified. So I wouldn't say that there was an outburst, but there was a structural mobilization, which I found very interesting. So I think with modeling the uprisings, this is one of the traps that you would just follow incidental instead of general track, or it could be also a strength depending on what has to be depicted. And I also would say, especially with the research that I have been citing, like the common knowledge is very different than the precise evidence that we can operate with. And generally, maybe how quickly it falls out of spotlight. So I think at the beginning of protest in 2020, it would be a very highlighted topic and important, especially for Europeans. But within 1 month, I haven't heard anything. So it was very interesting to observe if that does not bring a lasting change, how quickly the topic disappears.
So I always ask this of other designers because my young students always ask me is, what is your like one tip to young designers who are designing their first game, trying to publish their game or whatever? Because people always give different advices. So I would love your take on it.
I think I will come back to the advice that I gave also at Saganet. Those are the awards in Netherlands for young designers that are trying out new things. And the advice is make games worth your time. So whenever you say, this is either a topic, this is a challenge, this is a model, this is a story that I'm interested in, and there is no game that I can play about it, start creating. And especially if you are looking at the amount of games that is published every year, a lot of them fall into the same categories or the same trend. So there is a lot of room for new creations, and partially that was why Belarus exists, because I thought this is a topic I think that it has utmost significance, yet it is highly underrepresented. And I wanted to have a shorter game that I could play within 30 minutes. So I also didn't see much of that at the time. So my advice in short would be to make games worth of your time. You are the best judge, right? If you take, and to my students, I say that this is the best test. If you have the exam week, so you have just packed schedule, your focus is completely on your being as a student, or later your being as an employee, and you come home and you would play this game, that is a game worth your time. That is the highest relevance you can give it. So I give this advice to test it according to your ability to play it at the busiest times. If you would still do it, that means the game should exist.
So, as a flip of my previous question, someone else asked, in contrast to the previous question, just asked, what's the worst tip or advice you got as a designer?
I think that would come back to the perfect prototype. So if you have people that tell you to continuously work on your prototypes without any prospect of bringing it to the table, that would be for me very false. And I would also, I did have that personally. So I had people that look at your prototype and they say, oh, that's not what I'm looking for. Or they would sit in and start playing. And this is, of course, anecdotal, but we did have this one person that asked about nuclear energy in a Belarusian uprising. And it really stuck to my mind, because I was thinking, why would you try to change the game completely into nuclear security from what it is? So there are people that simply come into a game and they have an expectation of something very specific, even so they are not looking at your game. They are looking at the game they would like to have, but your game is in the way. And that advice would be often like, okay, you have to change completely your prototype, and you have to learn to bring that back to your attribute, saying, I have designed this as a realistic representation, in my case, of the uprising in Belarus, and I do not want it to be more interactive, and I do not want it to play with 6 persons. Yeah. So you are able to see that this is not a game for everybody, and it is for sure not the game that somebody must have. Otherwise, they can design it yourself, right? That there is always a way to bring in new creations, but not remaking your creation into what one individual wants. So the better advice would be this: go to playtesting and change everything every time, right? There is no core of the game in that instance. So if you do not have this established ideas of what the game achieves and what it is, And it can come later, right? It can be iterative, but don't let it be kind of always changed by the whimsies of others. Make your stand as a designer.
I don't see any other questions at the moment, so I will reserve the right to ask the last one, which is, what are the other games on your list?
Thank you. I was thinking maybe it comes up. So I'm working currently on a cyber combat game. And my concept is it would be a card game that can be played as a arena mode, meaning person versus person. So it's a standoff on a cyber terms. So let's say I sabotage your servers and you throw a botnet on me, and we see which cyber capability was stronger. But it could also be a deck that comes into a conventional combat, and then it is mixed with the other cards and interacts with the battlefield. So that is the game that I am bound to, meaning I cannot work on the other games until I finish this one. That is number one. But if I will finalize, or when I will finalize the cyber combat game, I have the Azovstal postcard on my list, which actually started with the Game Jam. I think now Kickstarter launched for the postcards from Second World War. So they have produced a postcard for battle, and it is 5 to 10 minutes solitaire play. And I really wanted to take part in it, but I was too late. But I started designing the Azovstal battle, which would be the challenge that Ukrainians have faced. So there were kilometers of underground tunnels under the cement factories, steel factories, and civilians would hide out there. And the military would have to move around trying to protect them. And the Russians would consecutively throw different waves of armaments and units on them. So I was thinking that this postcard could be, in short, whether you are able to bring the civilians into safety from underground. My third position is actually Iran, the dancing revolution. And the idea would be to follow Belarus mechanics, but not with dice, but with cards. So you would still try to build majority, but I would like it to be less random. And in that instance, I would take much more incidental versions of the events. And there would be a kind of scoring differences for both players. So these are my top three. And probably as a designer, you also have this where your brain just shifts into design of every interesting conflict. So I often just watch something and I think, oh, that would be a great board game. And I have to stop myself. So I put it on the list and I limit to one development at a time. So I do hope that Cyber Card Game Advanced Prototype is finished middle of October.
So I do not see anything else except some interest in your micro game. So hopefully you finish your cyber game soon. Thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon for our webinar series, and thank you to our speaker again for giving her second webinar for Georgetown.
Yes.
I appreciate it, and thank you everyone. Have a good day.
Thank you. See you maybe in 2 years for the first talk.